Welcome to Discipleship for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material. So, I want you to imagine, just for a second, sitting in this cold, damp dungeon.
Yeah, pretty bleak start, but go with it.
Right, very bleak. So you're chained to the wall. And every single day, the guards come in, they grab a few of the prisoners right around you, and they drag them out to be executed.
You're just watching this happen.
Exactly. You watch them go, knowing with absolute certainty that your turn is coming. You have exactly 1 hour left before the guards return for you.
Wow, 1 hour.
Yeah, 1 hour. And that single hour is just enough time to call for the warden, review your case, and potentially, secure a full pardon to save your life.
Which is obviously what any sane person would do.
You would think so.
Mm-hmm.
But instead of crying out for the warden, instead of frantically examining your sentence, you pull a deck of cards out of your pocket and ask the guy chained next to you if he wants to play a game.
It's completely insane. But the absurdity of that image is the exact spiritual burden driving Blaise Pascal in his masterwork, the Pensées.
Yeah, he was really bothered by this.
Deeply bothered. He looks at the sophisticated, educated elites of 17th century France, and he literally sees prisoners playing cards while the executioner sharpens his axe.
Wow.
They are just obsessed with trivialities. Status, wealth, entertainment, while utterly ignoring the impending reality of death and the eternal state of their own souls.
So our mission for this deep dive is to take that profound, haunting observation and hold it up against a very specific, unchanging standard today.
Right. We need a baseline to measure this against.
Exactly. And our framework is the master instruction source. We're talking about the 8 core instructions from Jesus for discipleship.
That's repentance and faith, self-denial and cross-bearing, total devotion to God's kingdom, and humility and service.
Yeah. Plus the law of love, secret obedience, forgiveness, and fruitfulness. So the goal is to take sections 3 through 6 of Pascal's notes and lay them directly over those teachings of Jesus.
We want to find out where this brilliant mathematical genius perfectly captures the essence of following Christ and, where his intense, sometimes cynical worldview creates some friction with the actual demands of the gospel.
Okay. Let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because the sheer emotional intensity of Pascal's writing here, especially around Thought 194, it really caught me off guard.
Yeah, it's not exactly detached academic theology, is it?
Not at all. You're reading the frantic warnings of a guy who is watching a building burn while the people inside are, admiring the wallpaper.
But that's a great way to put it.
He describes human apathy regarding eternity as a monstrous carelessness. People don't know where they came from, they have no idea what happens after death, and they actively choose not to investigate it.
And his reaction to that is incredibly telling. He actually states that this carelessness concerning their eternal soul moves him more to anger than to pity.
And that anger is what initially threw me off when I was reviewing the material. It feels, a bit harsh.
It does feel aggressive at first glance.
Right, because if someone is genuinely lost or just overwhelmed by the complexities of religion, responding to them with fury seems to violate that basic Christian call to love and gentleness.
Yeah, Jesus had immense compassion for the crowds because they were like sheep without a shepherd.
Exactly. So why is Pascal so furious at the skeptic who simply wants to live their life without being crushed by existential dread every waking moment?
What's fascinating here is that we have to look closer at who he is actually angry with. The text reveals that Pascal possesses deep, profound compassion for the honest seeker.
Oh, so he's not just yelling at everybody.
No, not at all. In that very same thought, he explicitly states that he pities those who sincerely bewail their doubt. If someone regards their lack of faith as a great misfortune and searches for the truth, he is incredibly tender toward them.
Okay, that makes more sense. So who is the anger for?
His fury is reserved exclusively for the performative skeptic. He is addressing a specific subculture in France at the time, the libertins, or freethinkers.
The wealthy elites.
Exactly. Aristocratic individuals who treated atheism or agnosticism as a badge of intellectual superiority.
They were basically bragging about their ignorance.
Yeah.
They viewed throwing off the constraints of religion as a sign that they were highly enlightened, sophisticated, modern people.
Precisely. Pascal recounts conversations with people who haughtily declare, I have now thrown off the yoke. I do not believe there is a God who watches my actions.
And they say it proudly.
They say it with a smirk. To Pascal, this is the ultimate cognitive dissonance. He asks how anyone can find joy in the belief that they are nothing more than a momentary collection of atoms destined for eternal nothingness.
Right, like how is that a flex?
It's not. Bragging about being in impenetrable darkness is not a sign of genius. It is a symptom of a diseased mind. He finds the vanity of pretending that ignoring your own terminal condition makes you superior to be deeply, fundamentally sickening.
That performative apathy is the wall he has to break through. You can't just hand a thick theological treatise to a guy who's proud of not caring.
No, he won't even open it.
Right. You have to disrupt his entire operating system.
Yeah.
And because Pascal was one of the foremost mathematicians of his era, the guy literally helped invent the mathematical theory of probability.
Which is just wild to think about.
Totally wild. So he decides to speak to the aristocratic gambler in the only language they respect, the language of the wager.
Yes. The famous Pascal's wager, outlined in Thought 233, is perhaps the most misunderstood piece of his philosophy.
People usually think of it as a cheap trick, right?
Yeah, a lot of critics view it as a mercenary, self-serving approach to faith. But within the context of his goal, it is a surgical strike against apathy. He begins by establishing a fundamental limitation. Human reason by itself cannot definitively prove the existence of an infinite God to a skeptical mind.
And the logic there is really sound. We are finite creatures. Our brains operate in finite dimensions, time, space, limited capacity.
But God, by definition, is infinite.
Exactly. Pascal argues there is an infinite chaos separating us. You cannot use a finite measuring stick to prove the dimensions of an infinite room.
So the arrogant freethinker who demands a mathematical proof of God before they will believe is demanding a logical impossibility.
Right. And because definitive proof is impossible, Pascal concludes that humanity is forced into a position of gambling. You must place a bet on whether God is or God is not.
And the skeptic usually responds, well, I choose not to bet. I choose to remain neutral. I just won't play the game.
But Pascal's counter to that is brilliant. He says neutrality is an illusion. He writes, you are embarked.
You're already on this ship.
Yeah, you are already alive. You are already moving toward death. By living your life as if there is no God, you have already placed your chips on the table. The bet is happening whether you consent to it or not.
So the game is mandatory. The question then becomes how to evaluate the stakes. And this is where the probability math comes in.
Okay, lay out the math for us.
You have a coin flip. Heads. God exists. Tails. God does not exist. If you bet on tails that God does not exist and you are right, what do you win?
You get to keep your finite life. You get your poisonous pleasures, as Pascal calls them.
Right. Glory, luxury, status, physical indulgence, a few decades of doing whatever you want, followed by eternal nothingness.
But look at the alternative. If you bet on heads that God exists and you live your life accordingly, seeking him, serving him, what is the potential payout?
The payout is an eternity of infinite happiness.
And Pascal, the mathematician, points out that anytime you have an equal chance of gain or loss, betting a finite resource to win an infinite reward is the only rational move.
Even if the odds of God existing were 1,000,000 to 1, the fact that the reward is infinite means the expected value of the bet is mathematically infinite.
To refuse to stake a finite temporary life for the possibility of an eternal infinite joy is not intellectual superiority. It is, in Pascal's own words, to act stupidly.
Evaluating this against our master instruction source is really powerful because the wager maps flawlessly onto Jesus' core instructions of total devotion and self-denial.
Oh, absolutely. When Jesus says, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me.
For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it.
Yes. He is essentially stating the terms of the wager right there.
The resonance is undeniable. Jesus continually demanded that his followers calculate the cost of discipleship. Think about the parables he told.
Like the merchant finding the pearl of great price.
Exactly. Finding that pearl and selling absolutely everything he owned to buy it. That is the essence of betting the finite to gain the infinite.
Pascal explicitly tells his reader that taking this wager requires renouncing the finite world. You cannot hold on to the poisonous pleasures of selfish ambition or worldly glory if you want to win the infinite kingdom.
You have to push all your chips into the center of the table, no hedging your bets.
But, pushing all your chips in requires a massive shift in self-perception. You don't just abandon the pursuit of worldly glory unless you realize that worldly glory is fundamentally broken.
Which leads right into Pascal's concept of the paradox of man. He paints this picture of humanity that is simultaneously terrifying and breathtaking.
This is Thought 347, right? Where he introduces the metaphor of the thinking reed.
Yes. The image of the reed is a profound meditation on human vulnerability. Pascal observes that man is the most feeble thing in nature.
We really are. We're so fragile.
We're incredibly fragile. He says a vapor, a single drop of water, or a microscopic organism is enough to kill us. Our physical existence hangs by a thread every single moment of the day.
Yet, he refuses to leave humanity in a state of utter insignificance. The paradox arrives in the second half of that thought.
This is the breathtaking part.
He writes that even if the entire universe were to rise up and crush a human being, the human being would still be more noble than the universe that destroyed him.
Wait, why is that? How is the crushed reed more noble than the universe?
Because the human knows he is dying. The universe, for all its massive, terrifying power, its crushing gravity, its burning stars, is blind. The sun does not know it is hot.
The ocean does not know it is deep.
Exactly. But we, these fragile little reeds, possess thought. We can comprehend the universe. We can anticipate our own mortality. Our dignity consists entirely in our awareness.
But that awareness is also the source of our deepest misery, which Pascal explores through the metaphor of the Deposed King.
I love this metaphor. It's in Thoughts 398 and 409.
He argues that all the miseries of the human condition actually prove our inherent greatness. He asks a brilliant rhetorical question: who is unhappy about not being a king unless they were once a king and have been deposed?
Right, because a peasant who has farmed dirt their entire life doesn't wake up weeping because they don't have a golden
They
three.
don't miss what they never possessed.
But humans walk around every day with a profound, unshakable sense that the world is broken. We are constantly outraged by injustice, heartbroken by betrayal, and terrified of death.
We desire perfect love, perfect peace, and infinite meaning.
And we are perpetually miserable when we cannot find them in this finite world. Pascal suggests this misery is the ultimate proof that we are made for those things.
We possess the phantom limb of Eden.
Oh, that's a great phrase. The phantom limb of Eden.
We are fallen royalty, stumbling around in the ruins of our original nature. And this concept is the absolute philosophical bedrock required for the Christian call to repentance and faith.
Because you can't fulfill Jesus' instruction to repent if you don't believe you're fundamentally broken to begin with.
Right. The secular narrative often suggests that humanity is basically good, just, occasionally making mistakes due to a poor environment or lack of education.
But Pascal completely demolishes that.
Yeah.
He points out the internal war in every person between reason and the passions. We know what is good, yet we constantly choose what is destructive.
It is the Apostle Paul's lament in Romans 7 brought to life. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing.
Recognizing this divided, deposed state is the only path to true humility. Pascal insists that greatness consists in knowing our wretchedness.
In Thought 422, he articulates the exact posture of a repentant disciple. He says, "It is good to be tired and wearied by the vain search after the true good, so that we may stretch out our arms to the Redeemer."
The exhaustion of trying to save ourselves.
Yeah, the exhaustion of trying to find infinite meaning in finite pleasures, that is what finally brings a person to the foot of the cross.
So the intellectual groundwork is laid. The skeptic has been shaken out of their monstrous indifference. They understand the logical necessity of the wager.
They recognize their own wretchedness as a deposed king.
But here's where it gets really interesting. A skeptic might look at all this and say, okay, the math makes sense, my brokenness makes sense, I want to believe, but I don't.
I look inside myself and my heart is completely cold.
Exactly. I cannot just force my brain to generate faith on command. And Pascal, a man who devoted his entire life to logic and reason, gives an answer that completely undermines the supremacy of the intellect.
He introduces a vital theological concept: the limits of human reason in the face of a deus absconditus, a hidden God.
Pascal points out in Thought 243 that it is astounding that the canonical writers of the Bible, like David or Solomon, never use complex physics or arguments from nature to prove God.
They never built philosophical syllogisms to logically trap someone into belief.
If anyone could have used cosmology or intelligent design arguments, it was the authors of Scripture. But they don't attempt to prove God like a geometry theorem.
Because a God who could be definitively proven by human reason would not be the God of the Bible.
That's a huge claim. Why not?
In Thoughts 194 and 288, Pascal explains that God has intentionally disguised himself. The logic here is deeply tied to the nature of love and free will.
Free will.
Right. If God were to reveal himself in undeniable, overwhelming glory, like the noonday sun belief would not be a choice, it would be a forced surrender.
You wouldn't have an option but to believe.
Exactly. By remaining hidden, God preserves human agency. He hides from the proud, from the arrogant philosophers who think they can dissect the divine with a telescope.
But he provides just enough light to reveal himself to the humble who actively seek him.
That dynamic is what produces Pascal's most famous and perhaps most heavily quoted line in Thought 277, "The heart has its reasons, which reason does not know."
Now, modern culture has totally hijacked that quote to mean like, do whatever your emotions tell you or follow your feelings.
Yeah, they slap it on a bumper sticker. But that is not what Pascal meant at all.
Not in the slightest. For Pascal, the heart is the faculty of intuition. It is the part of the human soul that grasps first principles, things like space, time, motion, and numbers.
Reason builds upon those principles, but it cannot prove them. You just know them intuitively.
He argues in Thought 278 that it is the heart which experiences God, and not the reason. Faith is God felt by the heart, not God deduced by the intellect.
Applying this to the master instruction source perfectly illuminates Jesus' teachings on fruitfulness.
Because Jesus constantly emphasized that the internal state of the heart determines the external fruit of the life.
A good tree bears good fruit. A bad tree bears bad fruit.
You can have a flawlessly logical theology.
Yeah.
You can memorize the entire New Testament in the original Greek. But if your heart has not intuitively experienced the presence and grace of God, you are just an intellectual repository, not a disciple.
True discipleship is a transformation of the affections, not just the acquisition of data.
But this leaves that paralyzed skeptic in a really difficult position. If reason isn't enough and their heart refuses to feel God, how do they move forward?
This is where Pascal offers his most controversial and honestly psychologically fascinating advice.
He tells the skeptic to look at those who have gone before them, right?
Yeah.
People who were once paralyzed by doubt but are now believers.
Yeah. How did they do it? Pascal says. Act as if you believe. Take the holy water. Have the masses said.
He argues that engaging in the physical customs of religion will naturally make you believe and will deaden your acuteness.
Bending the machine, as he calls it. He argues in Thought 252 that humans are not purely intellectual spirits. We are embodied creatures.
We are as much automatic as we are intellectual. Custom and habit are actually the sources of our strongest beliefs.
The cognitive behavioral psychology behind this is remarkably prescient. Pascal understood embodied cognition centuries before modern psychology gave it a name.
It's mind-blowing that he figured that out back then.
He realized that our physical posture, our routines, and our habits actively rewire our neural pathways. If you physically kneel in prayer every morning, even if your mind is full of doubt, the physical act of kneeling begins to train your brain towards submission and reverence.
The body leads and the mind eventually follows.
He is telling the skeptic to use the machine of habit to bypass the intellectual roadblocks and slowly cultivate the soil of the heart.
The psychology might be brilliant, but we really have to push back hard on the theology here.
We do.
When we hold this advice up against Jesus' core instructions, a massive tension emerges, specifically regarding secret obedience and fruitfulness.
Yeah, Jesus was absolutely scathing toward the religious leaders of his day, precisely because they had mastered the machine while their hearts were dead.
He called them whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, full of dead man's bones on the inside.
The Pharisees were the ultimate practitioners of taking the holy water and saying the masses without any internal reality.
Exactly. Jesus commanded that acts of devotion, fasting, praying, giving should be done in secret, flowing organically from a pure heart that loves God. He condemned performing religious customs as a mechanical process.
And yet Pascal is suggesting precisely that.
Isn't Pascal essentially telling people to fake it till they make it?
No.
Doesn't relying on behavioral modification risk building the exact kind of hypocritical, hollow religion that Jesus dedicated his ministry to dismantling?
The tension is very real. Pascal, driven by his desperate desire to save his friends from the eternal consequences of that dungeon we talked about, leans incredibly heavily on pragmatic behavioral modification.
He's just trying to get them out of danger.
Right. He sees the human mind as chaotic and flighty, and he believes the heavy anchor of religious habit is the only way to hold a person steady long enough for grace to take root.
He views the external actions as scaffolding. You put the scaffolding up around a building under construction to hold everything in place until the internal structure is strong enough to stand on its own.
Yes, but the danger of scaffolding is that sometimes people mistake it for the building.
Oh, that's a good point.
If a disciple relies exclusively on the machine of taking holy water, attending church, or reciting prayers without fiercely pursuing the inward transformation of the heart, they risk a severe discipleship failure.
It becomes just empty ritual.
Pascal's advice can be a helpful, pragmatic starting point for someone entirely paralyzed by doubt. Taking a step of physical obedience when you don't feel like it is a valid spiritual discipline.
But it falls critically short of the mature discipleship Jesus demands.
Exactly. Mature discipleship is where obedience is the natural, joyful fruit of a heart that has truly repented and experienced the love of God. The external action must eventually become an expression of internal reality, not a replacement for it.
That distinction between scaffolding and the actual building is so crucial. Now, speaking of areas where Pascal's worldview creates severe tension with the teachings of Jesus, we really have to examine his views on human justice in Section V.
Oh boy, Section V.
When I first read these thoughts, the level of cynicism literally took my breath away. He doesn't just question whether human laws are fair. He completely deconstructs the idea that human justice has any objective moral foundation whatsoever.
He pulls absolutely no punches. In Thoughts 291 through 294, Pascal systematically mocks the arbitrary nature of human law. He points out the sheer absurdity of geographic morality.
Geographic morality.
Yeah, he writes, a strange justice that is bounded by a river, truth on this side of the Pyrenees, error on the other side. Wow. He highlights how an action considered heroic in one country is considered a capital offense a few miles away simply because a ruler drew an imaginary line on a map.
He illustrates this with a chilling scenario. He imagines a soldier asking another man, "Why do you kill me?" And the response is, "What? Do you not live on the other side of the water? If you lived on this side, my friend, I should be an assassin, and it would be unjust to slay you in this manner. But since you live on the other side, I am a hero, and it is just."
It's so dark, but he's making a profound point. He notes that theft, incest, and infanticide have all, at various points in human history, been codified as virtuous by different cultures.
So his conclusion is basically devastating.
It is. He concludes that human reason is so deeply corrupted by the fall that we have completely lost the ability to discern true universal justice. We mistake local custom and tradition for objective morality.
Wait, if human society is not founded on justice, what is it founded on? Because societies exist, laws are enforced. If it isn't moral rightness holding everything together, what is it?
His answer is raw power. Might Hyredes.
Just might makes right.
In Thoughts 298 and 299, he articulates a philosophy of power that feels almost Machiavellian. He states that while it is right that what is just should be obeyed, it is absolutely necessary that what is strongest should be obeyed.
Because justice without power is helpless.
Exactly, because wicked men will always oppose it. But power without justice is tyrannical.
But since we can't figure out what true justice actually is, we are left with a terrifying compromise.
Pascal spells out the compromise explicitly, and thus being unable to make what is just strong, we have made what is strong just.
Man, we have made what is strong just.
We obey the majority, or we obey ancient laws, or we obey the king, not because they are inherently righteous or morally pure, but simply because they have the might to enforce peace.
We slap the label of justice onto whoever has the biggest army because it is the only way to prevent society from collapsing into total anarchy.
Holding this philosophy up against the master instruction source reveals a profound discipleship imbalance. Jesus gave his followers the law of love. He instructed them in humility and service.
He called them to actively seek the kingdom's righteousness on earth, to be salt and light in a decaying world.
When Jesus encountered unjust systems, he did not passively submit to them simply because they held the power.
No. The contrast is stark. Jesus overturned the tables of the corrupt money changers in the temple. He publicly challenged the oppressive legalism of the religious authorities. He advocated for the marginalized, the poor, and the outcast.
Furthermore, the Old Testament prophets, whom Jesus fulfills, were characterized by their relentless, fiery demands for systemic justice. Prophets like Amos and Micah raged against leaders who crushed the poor, demanding that justice roll down like waters.
Yet Pascal's perspective seems to be this, spiritualized resignation. He's essentially arguing that human justice is a lost cause, so believers shouldn't waste their time trying to fix it.
Just submit to whoever holds the power.
Right, because fighting the system will only cause chaos, and preserving the peace is more important than achieving justice. That feels like a massive underemphasis on the Christian's active duty to advocate for the oppressed.
It strips the gospel of its prophetic voice against tyranny.
It really does. It's a severe limitation in his theology.
But, and this is crucial, To understand why a man as brilliant and deeply faithful as Pascal arrived at such a passive, cynical conclusion, we must examine the specific historical trauma that shaped his worldview.
Because he wasn't just theorizing in a vacuum.
No, he was not theorizing in a peaceful, stable democracy. He was writing in mid-17th century Europe.
The context is everything here.
Yeah.
And we really want to make sure we're just reporting on the historical context impartially. We aren't endorsing any modern political views left or right.
Yeah.
We just need to understand Pascal's world.
Absolutely. Pascal grew up in the shadow of the 30 Years' War, a conflict that remains one of the most destructive in European history.
It was horrific. Entire regions of the continent were decimated. Millions of people died from battle, famine, and plague, largely because different factions were fighting over who had the quote-unquote just claim to religious and political authority.
And closer to home, France itself was ravaged by the Fronde, a series of brutal civil wars. Pascal witnessed firsthand what happens when different groups decide they're going to fight for their version of true justice.
The result was not a utopian society.
No, the result was roaming armies, burning cities, and slaughtered peasants. For Pascal, the pursuit of political justice had led exclusively to rivers of blood.
Therefore, he concluded that the highest pragmatic good in a fallen world is the avoidance of civil war.
He gives a brilliant, somewhat dark analogy to explain why we should yield to arbitrary power to keep the peace. In Thoughts 3:18 and 3:19, he talks about the four lackeys.
Oh, I love this story. So he imagines two men arguing over who gets to go first through a door or who gets the place of honor. Both men are equally clever. Both are equally virtuous.
If they try to decide the matter by reason or true justice, they are tied.
Right. The only way to resolve it is physical combat. But, Pascal notes, one man has 4 lackeys, 4 armed servants, and the other man only has 1.
Pascal writes, "This can be seen, we have only to count. It falls to me to yield, and I am a fool if I contest the matter. By this means we are at peace, which is the greatest of boons."
To Pascal, it doesn't matter if the guy with 4 lackeys is an arrogant fool. You yield to his might because contesting it leads to violence.
He applies this same logic to the monarchy in Thought 320. He points out how objectively unreasonable it is to choose the eldest son of a queen to rule a massive nation.
Yeah, you wouldn't choose the captain of a ship just because he was born into a wealthy family. You would choose the person who actually knows how to navigate.
But because human beings are unruly and ambitious, if we tried to elect the most virtuous leader, we would constantly slaughter each other over who that person is.
So by attaching supreme power to something completely indisputable like birth order, we remove the cause of civil war. We embrace an absurd system to maintain a necessary peace.
This is where modern listeners must exercise careful discernment. There's profound spiritual value in Pascal's observations, but there are also severe limitations dictated by his trauma.
What's the spiritually valuable part we should keep?
The spiritual value lies in how brilliantly he exposes the vanity of human status. By acknowledging that the guy with 4 lackeys or the eldest son of the king only rules by arbitrary might, Pascal shreds the pride of the aristocracy. He shows that wealth and rank are just borrowed qualities.
Borrowed qualities. I love that phrase. If you are honored because you have a massive bank account or a prestigious job title, people aren't honoring you. They are honoring the money and the title.
Take those away and you are just a fragile reed like everyone else.
That realization is a powerful catalyst for the humility Jesus commands. It prevents believers from being seduced by worldly power.
The limitation we must actively filter out, however, is his paralyzing fear of conflict. Pascal tipped the scales so far toward keeping the peace that he was willing to validate tyranny.
A modern disciple evaluating this against the master instruction source must recognize that while we are called to live peaceably with all men whenever possible, we are also commanded to love our neighbors.
And loving our neighbors often requires standing between them and the systems that oppress them.
Following the law of love sometimes means you cannot just yield to the guy with 4 lackeys. Sometimes discipleship requires confronting unjust power, even if it disrupts the peace.
That tension requires constant, prayerful discernment. You can't just adopt Pascal wholesale, but you can't dismiss him either.
Now, I want to transition from the macro level of kings and systemic justice down to the deeply personal micro level of our daily lives.
Okay, let's do it.
Because scattered throughout these deep theological musings, Pascal drops an observation about human psychology that is so shockingly prophetic it feels like it was written this morning.
You are referring to his thoughts on distraction.
Yes, the flies. In Thought 366, Pascal describes the mind of the sovereign judge of the world. Imagine a supreme intellect, a person entrusted with ruling towns and kingdoms, sitting down to make a profound, highly consequential decision.
You would think it would take the noise of a firing cannon to break their concentration.
But Pascal notes that it doesn't take artillery. It only takes the creaking of a weathercock or a pulley.
Or a fly buzzing in their ear.
Pascal writes that a single buzzing insect is entirely sufficient to render this magnificent intellect incapable of good judgment.
He concludes the thought with a sarcastic Italian phrase. Oh, ridicolosissimo eroe. O most ridiculous hero.
We think we are demigods, yet our minds are conquered by insects.
He expands on this in Thought 367, stating, the power of flies, they win battles, hinder our soul from acting, eat our body.
Now, when I read this, I am not thinking about actual, literal insects. I'm looking down at the glowing rectangle of glass sitting on my desk.
The translation to the 21st century is seamless. Today, the flies are our push notifications.
They are the algorithmic dopamine loops of social media.
They are our habit of constantly refreshing our email or doom scrolling through terrible news. The mechanism is exactly the same as Pascal described.
We are deposed kings, possessing the capacity to contemplate the infinite God, possessing the call to live out the radical, world-changing devotion Jesus commanded.
And yet our souls are completely derailed by a buzzing piece of technology in our pockets.
The profound question is why we allow it. Why does the brain prefer the fly over the contemplation of God?
Pascal's larger body of work on the concept of diversion answers this perfectly. We don't succumb to distractions because we are simply weak-minded.
We succumb to them because they serve a vital psychological defense mechanism.
Pascal argues that the natural state of humanity is so steeped in wretchedness, so shadowed by mortality, that if we ever stop and sit in silence, the existential dread will overwhelm us.
The fly, the notification, the constant stream of trivial entertainment, these are welcome interruptions.
They give us an excuse to look away from the terrifying reality of the dungeon.
We use the noise of the world to drown out the ticking clock of our own mortality. Modern technology companies haven't created this vulnerability. They have simply industrialized a fundamental weakness of the human soul that Pascal identified nearly 400 years ago.
This dramatically changes how we view temptation in modern discipleship. We often think of temptation exclusively as the urge to commit some massive, catastrophic moral failure.
But Pascal suggests that the most effective temptation is often just a swarm of tiny, trivial distractions that keep us from ever thinking about God at all.
We sit in the dungeon, the clock is ticking, the wager is on the table, and we are swiping on short-form videos because we are terrified of the silence.
So how do we take this ancient wisdom and apply it to our daily walk? We need to translate these insights into actionable discipleship.
The first area of application centers on those exact distractions. The practice here is to aggressively audit your flies.
What are the specific digital, social, or worldly distractions that constantly buzz in your ear and pull you out of the awareness of God's presence?
Is it the 24-hour news cycle that keeps you in a state of perpetual outrage? Is it the constant need to check your work email long after you've gone home?
Once you identify the fly, the challenge is to purposefully quiet the machine. It makes me wonder what would happen if I simply walked over and unplugged my wireless router for an hour tonight.
Would you feel that deposed king anxiety bubbling up?
Intentionally creating silence forces you to face the very things you're using the noise to avoid.
The second area of application requires evaluating your own personal wager. Pascal demands that we look at how we are staking our finite resources.
If you look at your budget, your calendar, and your mental energy, do they reflect the total devotion Jesus called for?
Are you betting your finite life on the reality of the infinite kingdom? Or are you secretly hoarding your chips trying to maximize your poisonous pleasures in the here and now?
It requires a brutal honesty about whether your daily choices align with the belief that eternity is actually real.
And finally, there is a profound question of identity to wrestle with. Look at your own pursuit of glory and validation.
When you are chasing a promotion, or obsessing over how you were perceived on social media, or relying on your bank account to make you feel secure, are you acting like a deposed king trying to build a pathetic, temporary throne in the dungeon?
Are you finding your worth in borrowed qualities instead of finding your identity in the humility and service of Christ?
Pascal's brilliant, piercing logic strips away our vanity. He refuses to let us hide behind intellectual pride or trivial distractions.
He forces us to look squarely at the brevity of our lives, the wretchedness of our fallen state, and the absolute necessity of staking everything on the grace of the hidden God.
So what does this all mean? As we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over building on that terrorist silence we just discussed. Pascal understood that even when we are entirely alone, our minds will actively invent distractions just to keep us from having to face ourselves. The next time you are waiting in line at the grocery store or sitting at a red light and you feel that sudden desperate urge to pull out your phone, pause for just 1 second. Leave the phone in your pocket. Sit in the quiet. And ask yourself, what is the silence trying to tell me about my soul that I'm so terrified to hear?
That's the heart of this section. This is discipleship for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.